My son called me strong, tough, and said I could handle anything life threw at me. When my heat got shut off in January and I called him shivering, he said I was tough enough to figure it out myself. When I fell on the ice and couldn't get food for a week, he told me I'd always been a survivor. When I got sick with a fever and lay in bed alone for days, he said strong women like me didn't need babying. "You're tough, Mom," he'd say with the mean brush-off that only comes from never having to test your own strength against real hardship. "You've always handled everything. You don't need me hovering over you." But he was wrong about strength, meaning you don't need anyone. And he was about to learn that being tough isn't the same as being safe from harm. While he thought my toughness meant I could survive anything alone, I was planning to show him what real cold feels like. The kind that comes when everyone who ever loved you stops calling, stops caring, stops remembering you exist. I raised Daniel with my bare hands and a will of iron after his father walked out when Daniel was 8 years old. Gary left us with nothing but a note on the kitchen table saying he wasn't cut out for family life. I was 26 years old with only a high school education, no job skills, and a son who cried himself to sleep asking when Daddy was coming home. Most women would have fallen apart under that weight. But I wasn't most women. I had a backbone made of steel and hands that knew how to work. I got a job at Thompson's auto shop changing oil and turning tires. Pete Thompson took pity on a desperate mother and taught me everything he knew about fixing cars. I worked 10-hour days in coveralls stained with grease, my back aching from bending over car hoods. Evenings found me at Mel's Diner washing dishes until midnight, my feet swollen and shoes held together with duct tape. I'd come home exhausted, check Daniel's homework by lamplight because we couldn't always afford the electric bill, and pack his lunch with whatever we had in the fridge. Some months we ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner 3 nights in a row. Some winters I wore my winter coat inside the house because we couldn't afford heating oil. But I made it work. I made everything work because that's what mothers do when they don't have any other choice. Daniel was such a good kid during those hard years. He helped with chores without being asked. He did his homework at the kitchen table while I cooked dinner. He never complained when other kids had things we couldn't afford. He seemed to understand that we were a team, him and me against the world. "You're the toughest mom I know," he'd tell me when I'd tuck him into bed after my double shifts. "Tommy's mom cries when she breaks a nail, but you can fix cars and cook dinner and help with homework all in the same day." "That's right, baby," I'd say, kissing his forehead. "Mommy can handle anything. We Hendersons are tough as old boots." Those words felt so good coming from my little boy. He saw me as strong, capable, someone who could solve any problem. I was proud of being tough. It meant I could take care of my son no matter what life threw at us. I taught Daniel to be self-reliant too. By age 10, he was doing his own laundry and cooking simple meals when I worked late. He walked himself to school because I couldn't always leave work to drive him. He learned that strong people don't wait for others to solve their problems. When Daniel graduated high school as top student, I sat in that gym in my best dress, the blue one I'd worn to every important event for 5 years. He gave a speech about beating the odds and thanking the strong woman who'd raised him. "My mom taught me that tough people don't make excuses," he said, looking right at me from that stage. "They find solutions." She showed me that when life knocks you down, you get back up and keep moving forward. I wouldn't be here today without her example of what real strength looks like. The whole gym stood up and clapped. I felt like the richest woman in the world. All those years of working myself to the bone had been worth it. Daniel got a full scholarship to State University to study business. During college, he'd call home every Sunday to tell me about his classes and plans for the future. After graduation, he got a good job at Hartwell Insurance, married Jennifer, and bought a house in the suburbs with a white picket fence. For the first few years, Daniel still called regularly. He'd invite me for Sunday dinners where I'd play with my granddaughter Emma and help Jennifer in the kitchen. Daniel would tell stories about growing up with a mom who could fix anything. "Mom's incredible," he'd tell Jennifer. "She raised me all by herself, worked 2 jobs, never once complained. She's proof that some people are just built stronger than others." But as Daniel's life got more comfortable, something started to change in how he saw my strength. What had once been respect for my ability to survive became an excuse for him to worry less about my well-being. My toughness became a reason for him to check on me less and less. The change started small and slow, like water wearing away stone. Daniel's phone calls went from every week to every other week to once a month. Finally, they dropped to only on major holidays like Christmas and my birthday. When I'd mentioned small problems during our brief conversations, a leaky roof, trouble with my old car, feeling lonely rattling around in my empty house, he'd brush off my concerns with quick fixes or reminders of how capable I'd always been. "You've handled worse than this, Mom," became his standard response to any problem I shared. "Remember when the furnace died that winter when I was 12? You figured out how to fix it yourself with a repair manual from the library. You don't need me to hold your hand through every little bump in the road." When I'd suggest he visit more often, he'd remind me that I'd always valued being independent and taking care of myself. When I'd mention feeling alone since retiring from the auto shop, he'd point out that I'd never been the type to need constant company to feel good about life. "You're not like other people, Mom," he'd say, thinking he was giving me a compliment. "You don't need all that hand-holding and emotional support. You're tough enough to handle things on your own. That's just who you are." His words stung more than I wanted to admit, but I didn't know how to argue with them. After all, I had always been strong. I had always handled problems by myself. But somewhere along the way, Daniel had forgotten that being tough didn't mean I didn't get lonely, didn't get scared, didn't sometimes need help or comfort or just the sound of someone's voice saying they cared. The pattern got worse as time went on, building like storm clouds gathering before a hurricane. Daniel rarely called anymore, and when he did, our conversations were short and focused on facts rather than feelings. When I'd try to share what was happening in my life, a doctor visit that worried me, a neighbor who'd passed away, memories that kept me up at night, he'd listen with half his attention and respond with practical advice rather than emotional support. "I'm sure the doctor knows what he's doing, Mom," he'd say when I mentioned being worried about some test results. "You've always been healthy as a horse. Don't worry about things you can't control." When I'd tell him about friends from the shop who were getting sick or dying, he'd remind me that I'd always been a survivor, that I shouldn't dwell on sad things that would just bring me down. "You're stronger than that, Mom," became his way of dismissing any fear or sadness I tried to share. "I've never seen anything get you down for long. You'll bounce back like you always do." The most painful part was watching him explain away my normal human needs as if they were character flaws rather than things all people needed to survive and thrive. He'd convinced himself that my toughness was not just a survival skill I'd learned out of necessity, but my actual nature, that I was basically different from other people who needed love and attention and comfort to feel good about their lives. During my 68th year, Daniel's dismissal became cruel and dangerous. He almost never called, and when he did, every concern I raised was met with dismissal. Every fear was brushed off as unnecessary worry. "Mom, you're being dramatic," became his response to anything that sounded like I might need help. "You've always been the type to figure things out yourself." The breaking point came during the worst winter in 20 years, when everything I'd feared about growing old alone became a dangerous reality. January hit our town with temperatures 15 below zero for weeks. On the 10th day of the freeze, my furnace died with a loud bang. I went down to look at it, my breath making clouds in the suddenly freezing air of my own home. The old unit was stone cold and wouldn't start. I called heating companies, but they were swamped with emergency calls. The earliest anyone could come was 3 days away. I called Daniel with fingers so stiff from cold I could barely dial. "Daniel, honey, my heat's out," I said, my teeth chattering. "The furnace died and I can't get a repair guy until Thursday. It's going to be below zero for the next week." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Daniel spoke with that familiar tone of mild annoyance. "Mom, you've dealt with heating problems before. Remember that winter when I was in high school and you kept the house warm with space heaters? You're good at solving problems. You'll figure something out." "This is different," I said, pulling my coat tighter. "I'm almost 70 now. The house is so cold I can see my breath. Maybe I could come stay with you for a couple days." Another pause, then a sigh. "Mom, we've got Emma's dance recital this weekend and Jennifer's parents are staying with us. Besides, you're tough enough to handle a few cold days. You always said Hendersons don't run from problems." "I'm not running. I'm asking for help. It's dangerous for someone my age to live in a house this cold." "You're being dramatic," Daniel said. "You've survived worse. Get some space heaters, wear extra layers. You'll be fine. You always are." "What if I'm not fine this time?" "Mom, stop thinking the worst. You're one of the strongest people I know. You don't need me swooping in to rescue you from every little problem." He hung up, leaving me in my freezing kitchen with ice forming on the inside of my windows. I bought 2 small space heaters and set up camp in my bedroom. But they could barely keep the temperature above 40 degrees. I spent 3 days wearing every piece of clothing I owned, sleeping under every blanket I could find. On the second night, a pipe burst in my bathroom, flooding the floor with water that turned to ice. I had to shut off the main water, leaving me without running water in a freezing house. I called Daniel again. "The pipe burst," I told him, barely able to talk through my chattering teeth. "There's no water and I can't feel my fingers. Please, I need help." "Mom, you're being silly," he said. "Call a plumber, get some bottled water. You've handled worse. Remember when the roof leaked? You lived with it for weeks. I was 30 years younger then. Age is just a number. Your mind is still sharp. You don't need babying. Tough, Mom. That's who you are." On the third night I stopped shivering. My hands turned white and I couldn't feel my feet. I knew this was frostbite, that my body was shutting down. I was dying in my own house and my son thought I was tough enough to handle it. I used my last strength to call 911. The paramedics found me barely conscious, my body temperature so low they had to warm me slowly to keep my heart from stopping. I spent a week in intensive care. The doctor said I'd been 6 hours away from freezing to death. Daniel came to the hospital once, acting shocked that things had gotten so serious. He kept saying he'd had no idea it was that bad. "You always handle everything so well," he said. "I thought you'd figure out a way to stay warm." I looked at him and felt something cold settle in my chest. My son had left me to die because he thought I was too tough to need help. That's when I made my decision. Daniel thought my toughness meant I could survive anything without help or comfort. He was about to learn what real cold felt like. The emotional cold that comes when everyone who ever loved you decides you're too tough to need their warmth. During my recovery, I planned carefully. Daniel visited twice, both times asking when I'd be back to normal, so he wouldn't have to worry. I began learning everything about his life, his job, friends, marriage, daily routine. To him, my questions seemed like normal motherly interest. To me, it was gathering information for war. Daniel worked as a senior insurance adjuster for Hartwell Insurance. He'd built good relationships with coworkers and was proud of his professional reputation. At home, his life revolved around Jennifer and Emma, with a comfortable social circle of friends and neighbors. I began with his workplace. I called his boss, Margaret Chin, introducing myself as a concerned neighbor with information about Daniel's character. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said, "but I feel I have a moral duty to let you know about Mr. Henderson's treatment of his elderly mother. He left her without heat during the recent cold snap, refusing to help when she had no water or food. When she called for help, he told her she was tough enough to handle it alone." Margaret was immediately interested. "That's concerning. Elder neglect is a serious issue. If he can treat his own mother this callously, I worry about how he handles elderly clients who need help." I began calling periodically as different concerned citizens who'd witnessed Daniel's neglect. Each call painted a picture of someone who lacked basic compassion for vulnerable people. Within a month, Daniel's reputation shifted from reliable professional to potential liability. The promotion he'd been expecting was quietly withdrawn. Colleagues started treating him differently. Next, I turned my attention to his marriage, the relationship that provided him with daily comfort and emotional support. Jennifer was a kind-hearted woman who believed in taking care of family, who would be horrified to learn how her husband treated his elderly mother. During our few interactions over the years, she'd always asked about my health and well-being, expressing concern that I lived alone and encouraging Daniel to check on me more often. I called Jennifer one afternoon when I knew Daniel was at work, my voice carefully modulated to sound worried and sad rather than angry. "Jennifer, honey, I need to talk to you about something important," I said. "It's about Daniel and how he's been treating me lately. I didn't want to cause problems in your marriage, but I'm getting scared and I don't know who else to turn to." Jennifer was immediately concerned. "Of course, Mom Henderson. What's wrong? Is Daniel not helping you with something?" I proceeded to tell her everything. The frozen house, the burst pipes, the days I'd gone without food because I couldn't drive on the icy roads and Daniel had said I was tough enough to figure it out myself. I described lying awake at night worrying about dying alone in my house, too proud to call again because my son had made it clear I was bothering him with my dramatic requests for help. "He says I'm too tough to need help," I said, letting my voice break just slightly. "But Jennifer, I'm almost 70 years old. I'm not as strong as I used to be, even though I try to be. When my heat was out, I was so cold I couldn't stop shaking. When I had no food, I ate crackers for 3 days because I was too scared to drive on the ice. But Daniel says that's just who I am, someone who handles things alone." The silence on the other end was telling. Jennifer was processing the image of her husband leaving his elderly mother to freeze and starve while dismissing her fear as character weakness. "Mom Henderson," she said finally, her voice tight with shock. "I had no idea. Daniel told me your heat was out, but he said you preferred to handle things yourself. He said you didn't want him fussing over you." "I never said that," I replied sadly. "I begged him for help. I asked if I could stay with you just for a couple days until the furnace was fixed. He said you had too much going on with Emma's dance recital." I could hear Jennifer's sharp intake of breath. Emma's dance recital had been important, but not more important than keeping an elderly woman from freezing to death in her own home. "I'm so sorry," Jennifer said, and I could hear the anger building in her voice. "This is not the man I thought I married. Someone who would leave his mother in danger because it's inconvenient to help. I don't know what to say." That conversation planted seeds of doubt that would grow into something much larger. Jennifer began watching Daniel differently, questioning the compassion she'd thought she'd seen in him. When he'd dismiss her concerns as overthinking, or remind her that she was strong enough to handle problems herself, she'd remember his elderly mother shivering alone in a frozen house. The doubt spread to other areas of their relationship. If Daniel could be so callous toward the woman who'd raised him, what did that say about his capacity for genuine care and empathy? If he could rationalize abandoning his mother by calling her tough, what would he do if Jennifer or Emma ever became burdens rather than sources of comfort? Their marriage began developing cracks that widened with every conversation about family responsibility. Every time Daniel showed impatience with Jennifer's emotional needs, Every moment when his response to problems was to remind people how capable and strong they were instead of offering actual help. Jennifer started asking uncomfortable questions during their dinner conversations. Why didn't Daniel ever invite his mother for holidays anymore? Why did he always have excuses when she suggested they check on me? Why did he get irritated when Emma asked about visiting Grandma? Your mother raised you all by herself, Jennifer said during one particularly tense dinner. She worked 2 jobs to put you through college. Don't you think we owe her some care and attention now that she's getting older? Mom's fine, Daniel replied dismissively. She's always been independent. She doesn't need us hovering over her all the time. That's not who she is. Who she is? Jennifer shot back. She's an elderly woman living alone. Of course she needs us to care about her welfare. That's what families do. But Daniel couldn't hear the criticism in Jennifer's voice because he'd convinced himself that my toughness was not just a survival skill I'd developed, but my actual nature. Something that made me fundamentally different from people who needed love and support to thrive. As their arguments became more frequent and heated, Jennifer began confiding her concerns to her sister Karen, who was dealing with her own aging parents and was horrified by Daniel's attitude toward family responsibility. He actually said his mother was too tough to need help? Karen asked in disbelief. Even tough people get old, get sick, need support. What kind of person abandons their elderly parent and calls it respecting their independence? I reached out to Daniel's friends, sharing my hurt about a son who thought elderly parents should be self-sufficient. Each conversation planted doubt about his character. The social gatherings that had been the foundation of their comfortable life became awkward and strained. Brad stopped inviting Daniel to their monthly poker games after hearing the full story of how he'd handled my heating crisis. I can't look at him the same way, Brad told his wife Sarah. If he can leave his mother to freeze, what kind of person is he really? Sarah shared Brad's concerns with the other wives in their circle, and soon Daniel found himself excluded from the casual gatherings and social events that had once provided him with community and friendship. Karen and Mike stopped including Daniel and Jennifer in their family barbecues and holiday celebrations, claiming they were keeping things small, but really not wanting to expose their own elderly parents to someone who had such a callous attitude toward elder care. Even the neighbors from Emma's school began treating Daniel differently. Parents who had once chatted with him at soccer games and dance recitals now gave him polite but distant greetings, having heard through the parental gossip network about his treatment of his elderly mother. By fall, Daniel's life had become a landscape of isolation that mirrored my own experience during that frozen winter. His job was in danger due to concerns about his character and fitness for working with vulnerable clients. His marriage was strained by Jennifer's growing doubts about the man she'd thought she knew. His friendships had withered as people distanced themselves from someone who could abandon his elderly mother in her time of need. But I still had one final blow to deliver. The one that would teach him what it truly meant to be abandoned by everyone who had ever provided warmth and connection in his life. I had saved the most devastating revelation for last. During our brief phone conversations over the months, Daniel had mentioned being excited about a promotion opportunity that had recently opened up at work. It was a senior management position that would represent the culmination of his professional development and provide the financial security he'd worked so hard to achieve. What Daniel didn't know was that the promotion required a comprehensive background check that included interviews with family members, neighbors, and community contacts. The company wanted to ensure that senior management candidates demonstrated strong ethical character and community responsibility both at work and in their personal lives. When the background investigator called me as Daniel's closest living relative, I was ready with a careful, truthful account of my son's character. I spoke sadly about a man who had lost touch with the values I'd tried to teach him, who had become so focused on self-reliance that he'd forgotten the importance of caring for vulnerable family members. "I raised Daniel to be strong and independent," I told the investigator with a heavy heart. "But somewhere along the way he decided that strength meant never having to help anyone else. When I needed him most, when my heat failed during the worst cold snap in 20 years, he told me I was tough enough to handle it alone and refused to help me." I provided dates, specific examples, and a heartbroken mother's perspective on watching her son lose his humanity in pursuit of a philosophy that valued independence over compassion. "I'm proud of what Daniel has accomplished professionally," I concluded, "but I worry about putting someone in a position of authority over vulnerable people when he's shown such callous disregard for the most vulnerable person in his own life." The promotion went to someone else. Daniel was told only that the company had decided to go with a candidate who better exemplified the organization's values of community service and family responsibility. He never knew that his own mother's truthful account of his behavior had cost him the career advancement he'd worked toward for years. The rejection hit Daniel harder than all the other consequences combined. He'd been counting on that promotion not just for the money, but for the validation that his years of hard work and dedication had been recognized and rewarded. Instead, he found himself passed over for reasons he couldn't understand, left to wonder what invisible flaw had made him unworthy of advancement. His confusion and frustration began affecting his performance at work. Colleagues noticed that he seemed distracted, irritable, less focused on his cases. The professional confidence that had once been his trademark began cracking under the pressure of isolation and repeated rejections. Margaret Chen called him into her office one cold December morning, her expression grave as she reviewed his recent performance evaluations. "Daniel, I need to discuss some concerns about your work quality and professional conduct," she said, spreading several client complaint forms across her desk. "We've received multiple reports about your interactions with elderly claimants, and frankly, I'm troubled by what I'm seeing." Daniel stared at the forms in shock. "I don't understand. I've always been professional with clients. What kind of complaints?" "Insensitive treatment of elderly clients during claim investigations," Margaret read from the first form. "Dismissive attitude toward an 80-year-old woman's concerns about home safety after a break-in. Lack of empathy when dealing with a widower's confusion about his insurance coverage." Each complaint painted a picture of an adjuster who treated vulnerable people with impatience and callousness, someone who seemed to lack the basic compassion required for working with clients during their most difficult moments. "These complaints suggest a pattern of behavior that's inconsistent with our company values," Margaret continued. "Combined with the reports we've received about your personal conduct regarding elder care, I'm recommending you for mandatory sensitivity training and professional development courses." Daniel left that meeting feeling like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Everything he'd built over 8 years of dedicated service was crumbling, and he couldn't understand why. He had no idea that his own mother had systematically destroyed his reputation by simply telling the truth about how he'd treated her. At home, things were just as bad. Jennifer had grown cold and distant, speaking to him only when necessary and spending most of her time focused on Emma or visiting her sister. Their conversations had become brief exchanges about schedules and logistics, stripped of the warmth and intimacy that had once made their house feel like a home. Emma, picking up on the tension between her parents, had become withdrawn and anxious. She asked uncomfortable questions about why Grandma never came to visit anymore, why Daddy seemed angry all the time, why Mommy looked sad when she thought no one was watching. "Why can't we see Grandma for Christmas?" Emma asked during dinner one evening, her 8-year-old voice carrying the kind of innocent directness that cut through adult pretenses. "Grandma's busy with her own life," Daniel replied automatically, not looking up from his plate. "But last year she made cookies with me and told me stories about when you were little. I miss her." Jennifer's fork clattered against her plate as she set it down harder than necessary. Your father thinks Grandma doesn't need family visits because she's too tough to get lonely. The sarcasm in Jennifer's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Daniel looked up, seeing the cold judgment in his wife's eyes, the disappointment that had replaced whatever love used to live there. That's not what he started, but Jennifer cut him off. That's exactly what you said. Your own mother called you for help when her heat was out, and you told her she was tough enough to handle it alone. He could have died, Daniel. Died alone in her freezing house while you worried about Emma's dance recital being too important to interrupt. Emma's eyes went wide with shock and confusion. Grandma's heat was broken and Daddy didn't help her? The question hung in the air like a physical weight, forcing Daniel to confront the reality of his choices through the eyes of his young daughter. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes people are too tough to need help? How could he make her understand that some people don't require the same care and concern that others need? It's complicated, sweetheart, he said weakly, but Emma was already looking at him differently, her child's sense of right and wrong struggling to reconcile the father she'd thought she knew with the man who could leave Grandma alone in the cold. That winter, exactly 1 year after he'd left me to freeze, Daniel experienced his own version of cold. His marriage deteriorated, Emma stopped coming to him for comfort, and his social circle vanished. On a cold December evening, Daniel called me, his voice broken. Mom, everything's falling apart. Jennifer wants a divorce. I might lose my job. All my friends have stopped talking to me. People are saying I'm cruel. What do you want me to say, Daniel? I want you to help me fix this. You're the strongest person I know. You think I'm strong enough to handle this alone, I said. You think tough people don't need help from others. Isn't that what you've always told me? Mom, please. I need you. Now you know how I felt. Sitting in my freezing house, calling you for help, and being told I was tough enough to figure it out alone. You did this. You destroyed my life. I just made sure people knew the truth about who you are. A man who leaves his elderly mother to freeze because he thinks she's too tough to need help. Please tell me how to fix this. The damage is done, Daniel. You taught me that being tough doesn't entitle you to other people's care. Now you get to learn what it feels like to be tough enough to handle everything alone. After I hung up, I sat in my warm living room looking at the snow falling past my windows. My heat worked perfectly now, my house was warm and my life was peaceful. I never spoke to Daniel again. Jennifer filed for divorce that spring, citing his lack of empathy. He lost his job 6 months later and was forced to sell his house, moving to a small apartment across town. The worst part for Daniel wasn't the professional or financial consequences. It was the silence. The soul-crushing silence that replaced all the voices that had once filled his life with warmth. 3 years have passed. Daniel still lives alone, working a smaller job and seeing Emma on court-mandated weekends. He sends me letters about volunteer work at a senior center, expressing regret for how he'd treated me. I read every letter, then file them away without responding. Emma visits me occasionally with Jennifer's permission. She's a bright, caring child who asks thoughtful questions about family. Daddy seems different now, she told me recently. He's nicer to old people and always asks if I'm warm enough. But he looks sad all the time. Your daddy learned some hard lessons, I said. Sometimes people have to lose everything before they understand what really matters. Now, on winter evenings when the wind howls outside my warm house, I think about the lesson I taught Daniel about the difference between strength and abandonment. He'd forgotten that even the strongest people require care and connection. When my son told me I was too tough to need his help, I decided to show him what real cold feels like. The kind that seeps into your bones when everyone who ever loved you decides you're strong enough to survive their absence. And now, when the snow falls softly past my kitchen window while I prepare dinner for myself and Mrs. Patterson from next door, I smile because sometimes the best revenge is giving someone exactly what they said they wanted, and letting them discover that being tough enough to handle everything alone is the coldest, loneliest way to live.